Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to introduce Tracy. Um, I only just came to know Tracy recently. Well, we've both been in scouting a long time. Our paths haven't crossed very much, but I am pleased to introduce him. He is a lawyer in Alberta, and he's actually been a member of Scouts Canada since 1965. So many years ago. He's been involved with virtually all of the sections. Um, he's the Calgary. Um, he was the Calgary region team lead for WJ91. Um, he was the Chinook DCC for program for 2005 to 2008, the Chinook Council Commissioner 2011 to 14, President Scouts Canada Property Society of Alberta 2011 to present, Secretary Chinook Scout Foundation 2011 to present. He has the Bar to the Silver Acorn he received in 2017. He has a Lifetime Achievement Award received in 2018. So we have somebody who has a huge amount of scouting experience and legal background to comment and help us with situations that were similar to those that Chris was relating to. So with that, Tracy, you have the floor.
Thanks, Barry. I can be heard. I unmuted everything, I think. Happy to be here this evening. Let's see. Do I have control over this show? Can I advance it, or are you advancing it, Chris? Let's see.
I can, if you wanted, I can advance slides for you. Or sorry, I'm unmuted. I can advance the slides for you if you just want to tell me to go to the next one, or I can I can share it with you. You have to share it. It's up to you.
Might help if you share. It'll just probably move a little faster.
Okay, so at the bottom of your page,
push it along.
At the bottom of you have to do the sharing. So at the bottom of your page it says share. So if you take share, you can take control. Yeah.
Okay, got it. No, I don't got it. If you could go to the next slide. Let's just move it on here.
Let me close this.
Okay. I want to point out that, as Chris's story has already suggested, crossing through U.S. customs at the border can be challenging, particularly because it has a lot of random elements in it. Each officer operates at their own discretion and has quite a great deal of authority to act independently. So when one day you might meet an officer who is rather intractable, very difficult to go through because they're following the book in very strict terms. Another day you might find another officer has a completely different attitude. So being turned away one day doesn't mean you'll be turned away the next day. Their authority is through a federal statute. It applies to federal law, and therefore you'll see in a few slides distinctions about how marijuana in particular is treated at the state level is not important at all. The next slide there. The officers at the border are not there to really intending to get in the way. They want business as usual to go flowing across the border, but they are trying to stop, of course, terrorism, but also illegal admission of people who shouldn't be going into the U.S. for various reasons, and as well illegal trade in things like narcotics. But also some very high concern about fruits and vegetables and things like that. One of the key pieces, though, at the third point is determining nationality. If you're a Canadian traveling across the border, you need government-issued ID. Passport in our context is most appropriate. If you're not a Canadian, If you're coming from a different nationality, then you should have a passport for that state. And many states don't need a visa to go into the U.S., but others do. And that information is available from Global Affairs Canada. We can provide more specific information about which countries do and do not need visas for entry at a later point. I wasn't prepared with that list for this meeting, but essentially all the processes that we've been talking about apply equally to a young person or a scouter from any nation, as long as they have a passport for their state of origin, and where necessary, travel visa for that state. Again, it's not always necessary. Many states don't need it. You're to be patient, understanding, and cooperative at the border. No signal of impatience is going to be rewarded. You seem bothered, harried, harassed. Even though you are overtired and fatigued and frustrated, it will not help you. It will end up making your experience worse. We could go to the next slide. There we are, the list of evil things: meats, fruits, veggies, plants, seeds, soil, animals, and plant products are all controlled. And you have to declare those things. It's not declaring the value that's important, it's just declaring that you have them. And youth traveling across the border are not a risk that they're trying to import crates of fruit and vegetables. But what is happening here is that a kid will have a sandwich jammed in their pocket, or an apple in their pack or something, and that will trip over this issue. So you have to be careful that before going to the border, that all these things have been taken out of everybody's pack and that they're not there at all. It really makes it a lot smoother. If you do declare and you show your sandwich, it probably will just get confiscated, but it's best if it's not there at all. If you're flying, that covers check bags as well as carry-on, certainly anything in a vehicle. If you've been on a farm recently, they'll ask you about that, and it's just because of the possibility that disease could travel in the soil that might be on your shoes, and also on vehicles, and tires, and in the undercarriage. So it's important that these things be cleaned off if you're coming from a rural area. And if you don't talk about that, if you don't declare you're from a farm, for example, then you might be refused. Next slide. Marijuana is the big issue right now at the border because it's legal in Canada, but not at the federal level in the United States. Some states are okay with it, but not the federal law, and that's the only one that matters when you're crossing the border. Even medical marijuana is not allowed at the federal level in the U.S. Recreational marijuana, certainly not. So while it's legal here in Canada, and you may have a prescription for marijuana in Canada, that doesn't matter. It is not allowed in the U.S., and you cannot go in the U.S. with your medical marijuana. Any importation is prohibited. So if you try to cross with marijuana, it will be seized. There may be a fine. You could be arrested. You will certainly be turned back unless you're a U.S. citizen. Next slide. This is just emphasizing the no exemption. And it doesn't matter that you're going into a state where it is legal. Next slide. As a result, you have only two reasonable choices. There is a third, but I don't think it's reasonable. The two alternatives at the border is to truthfully answer when asked about marijuana use or involvement, and I'll talk about that word in a second, is that you've never used it, you've had no dealings or no involvement with it ever in your whole life, ever, ever, ever. That's number one. You can truthfully say that, good. Say so, you're good, that's no problem. But if you can't say that truthfully, then it's best, as Chris suggested, to decline to answer, which is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. If you decline to answer, you will be turned back. but you can go back and try again the next day. The third alternative, a not so good one that I didn't list, is you admit to marijuana or cannabis use. Then things go badly for you immediately. The next slide, please. Just to emphasize the DTA, to decline to answer, you'll be refused, but there's no penalty, and you can try again. And you may not be asked. These questions are random. Sometimes you're asked about cannabis and marijuana, sometimes you're not. Hopefully you're not if you want to decline to answer. Next slide. If you do admit, and this is the third one that is not the good alternative, if you admit to marijuana use or being involved, then you get a lifetime ban immediately. It's possible, there is a lengthy and rather complex process to have that ban reviewed, just reviewed, and the review may or may not grant you re-entry opportunity. But it's expensive, time-consuming, and a risky tactic. You may not have the ban removed. So keep in mind that the word involved means even something like owning shares in a cannabis corporation, which many Canadians do. They went up quite a lot in the last little while. It's quite attractive to get involved. If you have shares in a marijuana corporation, then you are involved. As far as U.S. federal law is concerned, you are participating in an illegal drug trafficking network. That sounds pretty harsh, but that's their interpretation. It is reasonable to say that if you privately, I don't know, perhaps your RSP, you've had some marijuana stock for a little while, who's going to know? It's private. How can U.S. border crossing people know what you have in your private portfolio? You could run that risk in the hope that it is private. In fact, these days, very little is private against the information gathering systems of the United States. So if you do have shares in the cannabis corporation, you should decline to answer. So being involved is very broad, and it's far more than using marijuana. I'll keep that in mind. Next slide. What the officials cannot do at the border, but in interrogation, they sometimes use these tactics. They may say that if you don't tell the truth, they're going to do a drug test on you. Well, they actually can't do that and won't, but they'll nonetheless try it on you and see if they can get you to admit to marijuana use. So they may also say that they're going to run a lie detector test on you, and they can't do that either. But a lot of people crater when they are pushed with that information. And they also say that they'll hold you indefinitely or even arrest you for not telling the truth. If you decline to answer, that is a truthful response. You don't have to say anything more. They can't arrest you with that statement. Next slide. The interrogation, though, is designed to intimidate and break you down and make you admit to things. And young people are especially vulnerable, particularly because they'll think they can lie and get away with it. And border officials are pretty good at detecting lies. And if an admission follows, then the lifetime ban is likely. So the do not decline to answer, not replying, is the best thing to do. Next slide. That creates a risk management challenge at the border. If a pair of leaders are with a group and one of them DTAs, then they'll be turned back, leaving the youth with one adult, at least for a short period of time, till they're through on the other side. And transportation, accommodation, those issues need to be considered for rejected adults who may try the next day. Or if it's practical at another border crossing, but they'd still have to spend some time moving or accommodating before that happens. They may have to return home if they've admitted and got a lifetime ban. The next one. For youth, if we know in advance that someone might DTA, we could batch them, and that might, I think, be the best way to go. You have less likelihood of a random occurrence of the DTA in one group, and therefore one youth needing to have a scouter carved off to support them. But that's a management question beyond the scope of my presentation. Certainly, transportation and accommodation need to be provided for any youth with DTAs. They may try again the next day. If they did admit to use or involvement, then they may have a lifetime ban, and they'd have to return home. Next slide. For youth under 18, federal law in Canada says that someone under 18 can't legally consume marijuana. So admitting marijuana use not only triggers U.S. border crossing issues, but also violates Canadian law, and is a problem for the Canadian Scout Province of Law. So probably the best way to manage youth under 18 who would DTA is don't ask, don't tell policy. Otherwise, we're creating issues we probably don't want to deal with in this context. Only respond to admission or to flagrant use. Next slide. Might consider having an amnesty box near the point where the border is going to be crossed so that people can dispose of anything they might have. And don't ask questions about that in order to simply keep the crossing as smooth as possible. Of course, someone who uses an amnesty box would be DTAing, but they may not get asked the question. And if not asked, then they don't need to be concerned. They'll pass through the border. Next slide. It's possible that we'll have some members who are dual citizens. And there are many Canadians who are also dual citizens, often through one parent. And if they do have a U.S. passport, they're Canadian citizens, but they also have a U.S. passport, it would be advisable for them to travel on that passport, because a U.S. citizen cannot be denied entry. If they're actually physically in possession of marijuana or any other illegal substance at the border, they could be arrested. Anybody would be arrested. But if they've used an amnesty box just minutes before they hit the border, and they don't actually possess any marijuana, then they don't need to decline to answer. They can say, yes, I've had marijuana, but I don't have any on me right now, and they get to be admitted because the border is not closed to U.S. citizens re-entry. So traveling on a U.S. passport, that young person could go in for sure. Next slide. Any questions? I'm looking at the chat. Linked U.S. regulations about vegetables and things. Again, it's usually sandwiches and stuff in backpacks. Just have to clean those out before they go in. Yeah, the scouters on the flight, and then if one DTAs and turns back, and then what happens? That is a risk management challenge for consideration. And my presentation is bringing these issues forward. I'm certainly not bringing the solutions forward at this point. It's a matter for consideration. You have an experience here from Craig. Processed packaged foods like granola bars are okay. Generally, you're right. They are. It does give it violates the strict rule on the book. So if the official is following the book, that material would be confiscated. It's not going to result in a refusal to ever let you enter again. You're not going to get a lifetime ban, but you could lose your sandwich, your apple, or your granola bar. As long as you presented it, you declared it. I've got this granola bar. Okay, well, you were taking it away from me. And that's the end of the problem. But if you try to sneak it through, then you can be bounced at the border, turned back, and possibly, not necessarily, possibly given a lifetime ban. Does one actually say, I decline to answer, or just say nothing? You use that statement, I decline to answer, or you don't just stand there in silence. If you decline to answer, what happens to your flight arrangements? That's a good question, and something to be considered. Waiting till the next day will mean you're on a different flight, and there's all sorts of costs associated with that, and possibly a lack of availability in the flight. If a youth gets sent back, a scouter is turned back, who covers the cost of the scouter's flight? And who's covering the youth that are still going forward? There are complex issues here. If I'm not mistaken, I'm the only adult with my guys and the youth from PEI. Okay, it's good to know in advance who might be declining to answer. And that's all we need to know. We don't have to delve into why. It can range from marijuana use to marijuana stock options. If someone is going to DTA, we need to know in advance so that we can plan ahead and manage this group. Clustering would probably be a helpful thing to do. And if one gets turned back, at least it's a limited exposure. We only have one group to deal with instead of it happening in multiple groups and multiple flights. But again, that's a matter for others to consider. If anyone believes they should DTA, should speak to Barry as soon as possible. Yeah, I certainly believe anyone who's going to DTA needs to be identified as early as possible, both adults and youth. Are there any other questions at this point?
Just one question, and related to stock holding. A mutual fund may well have stock of that nature in it, and yet most people wouldn't know what is in their mutual fund.
That's true, Barry, and most of us have no clue. If you could truthfully say, I do not, it can be because you didn't know that one of your mutual funds had it, and you're speaking truthfully when you say that, and you're okay. You'll be fine. You can continue to represent that you didn't know. And it's reasonable that most people won't know what's buried in a mutual fund, unless perhaps it's a mutual fund titled the Marijuana Mutual Fund, in which case you'd have trouble dodging that one. But for the most part, we have no idea what's buried in our mutual funds. So I wouldn't be alarmed about that possibility. So unless you actually know that you have marijuana investments, then I'm not going to advise you to be concerned.
Thanks.
Tracy, I think the big thing is if anybody thinks they're going to decline to answer a question at the border, they need to speak to Barry, whether it's a youth or an adult, as soon as possible, because that's something we have to be prepared for. Finding out on July the 18th that we've got somebody declined at the border is not what we need.
Absolutely. Advance notice is going to be key to effective management of this risk. There's just a bit of an impediment within scouting that our own law and promise are going to perhaps intimidate youth under 18, feeling that it's illegal for them to have it, they can't admit it. But it would certainly be helpful that we know that they're going to DTAs, so there's a trade-off there, and that's a question for this team to manage.
You did comment that any youth under 18 or 19 who's used marijuana is doing so illegal, but I have had cases where youth have been prescribed medical marijuana and do use it.
That's true, Barry. They may be using it for medical purposes, and that is legal even under 18. So they wouldn't have that same barrier, that same issue. But they still cannot admit to using marijuana at the U.S. border.
Yeah, they have to DKA on that answer, right?
That's right.
Which again is why, as you said, Tracy, it's important that we're asking both scouters and youth who think they might have to decline to answer any question of Customs and Border Patrol to tell us now without focusing on any one particular issue. If they think they're going to decline to answer a question, they need to tell us now for whatever reason. And we don't need to know the reason. We simply need to know they're going to decline. They could decline to answer a question, which could mean that they're unable to cross the border at that time.
Yeah,
that's correct, Doug.
Yeah. Okay. We got more work to do on this one for sure. But Tracy, I want to thank you enormously for, I'm sure, everybody on the call. Your presentation has cleared a lot of questions that we had, and so we have a much better understanding of what the rules are, where the issues are, how to handle them. So thank you so much for joining us and helping us, and you can be sure that we'll be in touch further as we move forward on this. So thank you so much for being a part of the call and helping us in this way.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll move on. We are running out of time, I think, so I'm going to